Hello, welcome everyone to Frank Analysis. This is Franco, and I'm here to review this book that's called White Tears, Brown Scars: How White Feminism Betrays Women of Color. It's by Ruby Haman. She is an Australian journalist. She is also Middle Eastern, and it's pretty much just talking about that little subtitle of the book, how white feminism betrays women of color, sometimes leaves them out, and how this is all a buildup of generations going back centuries of how people of color were oppressed, and how not only is there a race factor there of and this stereotypical factor of how people view certain races, um, but there's also a misogynistic factor there, and this isn't a book that's trying to attack white women. This isn't a book that's trying to say, oh, white women are evil because they're white. But no, it's not about that. It's just that because of what they were born into, they didn't go through some of those hardships that women of color went through, and so there are some things that they are blind to, and because of how they're also treated by white men and sometimes even people of color, how they treat them, this is a feedback that allows them to act in a certain way that may sometimes, or as the author argues, oftentimes hurts people of color, specifically women of color, more so. But I have a guest here, San, returning to the show. I have them on. I have her on here to review this book with me because she recommended this book to me, and she's also a woman of color. So, San, why would you recommend this book to first white women, and then why would you recommend this to people of color?
Um, so I would recommend this book to women of color, just because I think they would probably have a lot to learn. So me being a woman of color, when I read this book, um, a lot of the information in it wasn't particularly new to me, other than like some um, information on like the history in different parts of the world. But
Yeah.
I do think that white women specifically have a lot to learn in terms of how some of the things that they do, whether it be consciously or subconsciously, has a very great effect and impact on women of color and how they're treated and perceived in the world, especially in the workplace.
Yeah.
Um, so I think it would be a good read for white women, to help them at least learn how to be more conscious of some of the actions that they take, um, and I guess really start to ask themselves, questions as to, why am I doing this? Um, why am I, they're not gonna, straight up ask themselves like, why am I being the damsel in distress? But essentially, like that's how, you know, that's basically like what they need to be asking themselves. Um, and for women of color, um, I would say this book is a good read. Uh, like I said, a lot of the information for me wasn't new. I've seen this happen. I hear about it all the time, like on
From
social
other
media.
women of color.
Yeah, like even in person. Even I've experienced things in the workplace that, there's things that I go through that I can tell that other people, especially white people, white women, are not going through at work, um, in the same way that I am.
So there, you would say that there's some validation there, that you experienced while reading this book, because you're like, oh yeah, I've seen that in the workplace, or and then this is probably what other women of color would also see. Yeah, like I get treated. The book talks about how black women also get treated as this like aggressive person, And whenever there's a conflict between a black woman and a white woman, oftentimes people take the side of the white woman because they make themselves look weak, because they start crying, or they start saying that they were feeling afraid because of the black woman's approach. And yeah, that's the role that she takes on, this damsel in distress. And then you were talking about experiences that you've gone through in the workplace. I'm sure you've felt like you were, people were treating you like you were not as smart as your coworkers who are white. And this is a problem with, again, it's generational. We see this in media, we see this in our education system. Um, Oftentimes, people of color are children of immigrants who are in the working class. They don't have as much wealth as white people. When they're in school, they get put into classes that are not as advanced as what some of the white people get put into. And this isn't, again, this isn't like always the case, but oftentimes people of color do get put in like the regular classes rather than in the honors classes. And so the people of color have to work harder to get into those higher level or more advanced classes.
Yeah, that's very true. I definitely think that people of color, especially women of color, do have to work a lot harder to, you know, get to the level or like receive the accolades that white people do. Um, and if we don't play a certain role, if we don't almost like fulfill, it says in the book, if we don't act nice, if we don't act like pets, essentially, then yeah, we're a threat, or we're kind of like infantilized in a way.
So there's examples in entertainment that show or hypersexualize women of color, or they use stereotypes. And then there's even stories that are brought up that before there was like TV and stuff, there would be stories of Asian women, or stories of black women or Hispanic women, or Middle Eastern women, and how they were hypersexualized.
Oh, you're talking
Um,
about the Jezebel and the Dragon Lady and
the Dragon Lady,
Princess
for
Pocahontas.
the story of Japanese women, and the Jezebel, yes. And the book also talks about some double standards, such as when, at least during the 19th century, when white women were engaging in interracial relationships with black men, and then they would get caught, the white woman would say that it was rape, and then the black man would get lynched after that. Also, that the white woman wouldn't have to face any punishment by the white men. And the white men, however, if they were feeling lustful enough to try to do something with a woman of color, and they actually did rape them, then the woman of color would not be believed. And
Well, not just
some,
that. Like, even if people did believe her, it was seen as like, it wasn't like okay, okay, but it was, like he's allowed to do that because, if we're talking about like the times of slavery, she was his property. So he could do that because black women were not seen as people. They weren't seen as
as
humans. They were just
property,
more
yeah, he's
property.
like, oh, he could do that because it's his property,
Yeah.
or
And then
she's
being,
his property.
more shapely, I guess, compared to white women, they were, that's when they were like, oh, they're asking for it because their bodies look a specific type of way.
Yeah, yeah, and then she brings up examples of how some of these um, biases are still seen today, where it's always like the white men at the top, like they're believed. Like she brings up Kavanaugh, for example, um, and white women are after that. They get believed oftentimes too, um, and then women of color or men of color don't get believed as much. because they're perceived as like, again, like these more like dangerous or uneducated people or hypersexual people.
Yeah, I think you're bringing up the comparison of like how when a white woman is up against a woman of color or like a man of color or just, overall person of color, her tears will be believed over their concerns, like the concerns that they voice. Meanwhile, if like a white man more than likely actually does do something like, say, sexually assaults a white woman and she cries, that doesn't work on them because white men are essentially the top of the food chain.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, I would recommend this for men to read because in order for us to make this a better world, and to make this a more conscious society, we got to understand all the problems that are happening here, and some of the things that we go through, um, or some of the things that women go through, we're not going to understand because we don't we're not going through that perspective 24/7, right? We're not walking in their shoes. This is an opportunity for us to read this and understand some of the day-to-day struggles that women of color may go through, and how sometimes some of the concerns that white women specifically have leaves out women of color, because the book talks about how white women, because of some of the privileges that they have, for being white, makes them really just want a seat at the table with white men, while leaving out women of color. What do you have to say about that, son?
Yeah, I think that's true. I remember reading a part in the book that was talking about how white women always, like to talk about feminism and how we need more like women CEOs and like women in higher positions at all these companies. But if you do see that, oftentimes it's white women who are at the top, and really, white women, they're white, so they do benefit from white supremacy. So really, it's not that they want to dismantle white supremacy. They just, like you said, want a seat at the table with white men. They want to be their equals. They don't want to be underneath them. But then where does that leave people of color, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're still down in the bottom rungs.
Yeah, like they want to fix some problems, but not all of the problems, and specifically the problems that affect people of color. And so, in order for them to understand that, they have to look at other perspectives. In order for men to understand the problems that a lot of women go through, we have to hear out from that perspective. Even if you think, because there might be some people watching thinking like, oh, like I don't have to read that, or I'm gonna disagree with everything in there. You haven't read the book, so how would you know? So go ahead. I mean, read the book, see from that perspective, and then you might come out understanding a bit more from that perspective.
I also
Um,
want to bring up the fact that like a lot of people, it could be men, but other people as well. But I guess since you're specifically talking about why men should read the book, um, we can't
oh, I
forget
was saying
that
like
like
all
there's
men, but yeah, white men, like especially, should be reading the book. But yeah.
yeah, I was going to say that I think all men should be reading this book, but I think particularly men of color too, because you know of colonialism, um, white women basically became like the epitome of femininity, right? Like
Yeah.
with all
Yeah.
these
Yeah.
Eurocentric beauty standards, like white woman is meant to be the face of beauty, the face of woman. Um, and so because of that, they're always put in these roles
Like,
where they are the woman, they are the damsel in distress. She is the one
yeah,
that
the
needs to
little
be
princess that has
protected.
to be protected. Like they're put on this pedestal.
Right. So that's why I think men especially need to be more conscious of how they are perceiving white women, especially when they are, you know, acknowledging or noticing situations where a white woman goes up against a woman of color. Are they going to have a particular bias towards, protecting the white woman or siding with her? And if so, like, what is the reason for that? Like, this is
Yeah.
something that men need to be conscious of.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, exactly. And the book goes in, like, brings up several historical examples, several recent examples. So I'm talking about things that happened in the 2010s, um, and things that happen in politics also with some political figures. Um, but there's going to be other books like this, and I would say this is still like a good start. Um, there's other books like Hood Feminism that I've heard break down the basics of white feminism in a way for that white people can understand better. But I think this would still be a good read, and it's an easy read. Um, there's certain points where I felt like the book was getting a bit redundant, but that's just because I've heard a lot of this stuff before. And San, I think you've also said that you've heard a lot of this stuff before also, but it was a good read for you as a woman of color because it made you feel more validated.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, yeah. So again, that's White Tears, Brown Scars, How White Feminism Betrays Women of Color by Ruby Hamad. Thank you guys all for watching and stay informed.